Black elderly man was humiliated for his skin. He said 5 words that made the SWAT team freeze. The early morning air was thick with tension. Robert Wilson, 72 years old, stood motionless before the yellow tape cordoning off the building where a hostage situation was unfolding. His tired eyes, a lifetime of stories behind them, never wavered from the SWAT team as they hurriedly prepared to storm the apartment. Tactical gear clanked, bulletproof vests adjusted, and weapons were checked. Officers barked orders into radios. It was chaos, but Robert stood calmly, like a rock in a rushing river. He had been there for hours, a silent observer of a scene that was spiraling out of control. Inside apartment 402, a gunman had taken 3 hostages, and the negotiations had failed. The pressure was mounting, and no one knew how to break the standoff. Robert's thoughts were sharp, not just from watching the tension unfold but from years of experience that no one else could see. "Sir, I need you to step back," a younger officer said, approaching him with an impatient expression. Robert didn't flinch. "I live here," he replied quietly, pointing to the second floor of the building. His words were simple, but they were met with skepticism. "Sure you do." "And I'm Batman," the officer said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Laughter rippled through the officers nearby, a thin veil over the underlying contempt. They looked at Robert like he was invisible, just another old man, as irrelevant as the crumpled newspaper in the corner. Robert adjusted his worn hat and took a step back. He wasn't surprised. It wasn't the first time he had been treated this way. His age, his color, they made him invisible, a non-entity. The officers had greeted the other white residents of the building with cordial smiles, nodding as they exchanged pleasantries. But Robert, he had only received suspicion, scorn. He could almost feel their eyes judging him, as if he didn't belong, as if his presence was an inconvenience to the grand plan of the operation. Across the street, Captain Richards, head of the operation, was speaking quickly into his phone, his mind absorbed in the tactical details of the crisis. The building plans were spread out on the hood of a police car, but nothing seemed to be working. 3 hours of failed negotiations. No progress. "Last attempt to make contact has failed," a voice crackled over the radio. "Delta team in position," another officer reported. Robert's experienced eyes scanned the scene. He noticed things others didn't: the positioning of the SWAT teams, the planned angle of entry, the lack of cover in key spots. The plan was flawed. He could see it. He knew it. He had seen it before. "This is going to go wrong," Robert muttered to himself, barely loud enough for anyone to hear. A month ago, he had noticed a strange man entering the building several times during the early hours of the morning. He had tried to alert security, but his concerns were dismissed with a casual wave. "I'll check it out later." That never happened. 2 weeks ago, he had smelled chemicals wafting from apartment 402, something toxic, something dangerous. But again, no one had listened. Now, here they were, on the brink of disaster. The voice over the radio interrupted his thoughts. "Team ready to enter in 60 seconds, it announced. Robert's gaze hardened. He couldn't stand by and let it happen. He had to act. With determination, he walked toward the police tape, crossing it with a quick, deliberate movement. No one expected it. They weren't ready for him to step forward. "Hey, stop!" shouted a police officer, rushing toward him. 2 officers grabbed him by the arms, pulling him back. "What the hell do you think you're doing, old man?" one of them sneered. Before Robert could respond, Captain Richards appeared, his face dark with annoyance. "Get this man away from here now," he barked. But Robert wasn't done. His voice, calm and unwavering, cut through the noise of the chaos around him. "You'll all die if you go in there like that," he said simply. Captain Richards raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" Robert's eyes locked with the captain's, his voice steady, a quiet authority beneath the calm. "I've known this building for 40 years. I worked on it. There's a passageway between apartments 402 and 404 that isn't on the blueprints. He set a trap." The captain laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. "Look, we have an expert here," he said sarcastically. "Someone take this gentleman away." But Robert didn't flinch. He held his ground, speaking again. You should listen to someone before judging by appearances. I saw the suspect carrying chemicals last week. I tried to warn you. Captain Richards narrowed his eyes, his disbelief palpable. And why should we believe you? He asked. In that moment, Robert spoke 5 words that would change everything. Delta Force Commander, Operation Tempest. The effect was immediate. The air seemed to freeze around them. Richards blinked, his expression shifting from contempt to confusion. The other officers paused, uncertain. What had just been said? It was a statement that carried weight, a hidden code buried beneath those 5 words. Captain Richards stared at Robert, a flash of recognition flickering in his eyes, followed by an uncomfortable silence. "Check it," Robert added, as if it was nothing. His voice was still calm, but now there was a knowing authority in it. Confusion turned to hesitation. Richards took a few steps back and quickly spoke into his radio. Seconds later, the color drained from his face. "Sir," Richards said, his voice suddenly apologetic, I apologize for the misunderstanding." Robert didn't respond. His expression remained unchanged. He had already seen enough. The puzzle pieces were in place, and now the next part of the operation would unfold differently. Not because of authority or rank, but because someone had finally decided to listen to him. And in that moment, Robert Wilson's quiet dignity was about to make all the difference. The tension in the air was almost tangible as Captain Richards, still stunned by Robert's 5 words, turned to his team. He had just been forced to confront something none of them had seen coming. The elderly black man they had mocked wasn't just some forgotten relic from the past. He was something far more dangerous and capable than they had ever imagined. "Get back," Richards ordered, his voice far less commanding now. The SWAT team, confused and unsettled by the sudden shift, stepped back, clearing a space for Robert. The atmosphere was thick with skepticism and a mounting sense of unease. But Robert stood tall, unmoved by the stares or the whispers. He had been underestimated for too long. "Motion sensor," Robert explained. "It's connected to a detonator. This isn't just chemicals in there. This is a trap, a well-planned one." Lieutenant Cruz took the tablet from Robert, studying the image. The motion sensor was nearly invisible, but it was there, and it was connected to something far more deadly than anyone had assumed. "How did we miss that?" Cruz muttered under her breath, looking up at Robert with new understanding. "You're right." Meanwhile, Carter was still skeptical. "Fine, but that doesn't mean the guy knows everything. He's just guessing." Robert didn't argue. Instead, he turned to the team, his voice unwavering. "You missed it because you weren't looking for it. I trained you to look for the things that don't fit. The smallest things. That's what gets people killed." Carter was silent, but his disdain was still apparent, like a dark cloud hanging over the group. He wasn't ready to give in to Robert's authority, not yet. But Cruz, who had been taking mental notes, looked at Robert with a kind of admiration. "You trained them, didn't you?" she asked softly. Robert nodded. 1987. Operation Blackhawk. I trained a special unit for infiltration and extraction. Simon Mercer was one of my best students. The mention of Mercer caused a stir. Richards looked at Robert in surprise. "Mercer? The hostage-taker?" "Yes," Robert replied quietly. "He was one of my best. Until Beirut." The room fell silent. Lieutenant Cruz quickly consulted her tablet, typing furiously, searching for any records of this operation. "There's no record of an operation in Beirut during that period," she said, puzzled. "Why?" "Some operations don't get recorded," Robert answered, his eyes distant. "Some of them are too secret. The Beirut incident never officially existed. Neither did I." Carter let out a short laugh, clearly uncomfortable. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, shaking his head. "We're supposed to trust an old man's word about a mission that's not even on record?" "I trained Simon Mercer," Robert said again, his voice now hard with the weight of the past. "I trained him to resist the techniques you're going to use. I'm the only one who can talk to him." The tension was thick. The officers didn't know what to make of Robert's revelations. His quiet confidence was unnerving. It wasn't just the fact that he had been a commander in an elite operation. It was the way he carried himself, like a man who had seen it all and was no longer interested in explaining himself to anyone. Captain Richards, still trying to grasp the gravity of the situation, spoke up. "If he says he knows Mercer, I believe him." The other officers exchanged looks, torn between protocol and the man who had just revealed secrets that no one else could have known. They had no choice now but to follow his lead. They had no one else to turn to. "We have less than an hour," Richards said, now fully committed to Robert's plan. "If you're right, we need to move fast." Robert, ever the steady presence, nodded. He was ready. He had trained for moments like this. And as the team readied themselves for what came next, Robert felt the familiar tension in his body, the calm before the storm. He wasn't just an old man anymore. He was the one who could see what no one else could. He was the one who would get them through this. And outside, as the SWAT team prepared to move, Robert Wilson was already thinking several steps ahead. He knew what was coming, and he knew how to stop it. The final countdown had begun. As the SWAT team positioned themselves and the clock ticked down, Robert Wilson remained unshaken, his every movement deliberate, as though the world around him had slowed. The noise and chaos of the operation seemed distant to him now. He had been in worse situations, seen more bloodshed, more confusion. But this was different. This time, he wasn't just an observer. He was the key. He turned to Lieutenant Cruz, who had become his ally in the storm. "The plan won't work," he said simply. "Carter's not seeing the whole picture. The angle of entry is flawed. You can't rush in like that. Simon Mercer has been trained to resist everything you throw at him. You need to think differently. You need to speak his language." Cruz, who had grown to trust Robert's instincts, nodded in agreement. "You want to be the one to negotiate?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "I have to," Robert replied. "It's the only way." Before she could respond, the radio crackled to life again. "The suspect is demanding to speak to someone named Wilson. He says he knows Robert Wilson. He'll only negotiate with him." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of their implications. All eyes turned to Robert, as if suddenly remembering the man standing before them was no mere civilian. He was a legend. He had been a commander in Operation Tempest. He had trained them, and now he was their only hope. Captain Richards, still absorbing the shock of Robert's revelations, looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and respect. "Do you know him?" Richards asked. Robert nodded, his expression impassive. "Simon Mercer. Former military. We served together a long time ago." The team was still reeling from the bombshell of Robert's history, but the situation was moving too fast. The hostage-taker had made his demand, and there was no time to waste. "I'm going in," Robert said suddenly, his tone unyielding. "I'm not staying behind the barricade." "What?" Richards objected. "That's against protocol. You can't." "Your protocols won't work with Simon," Robert interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "I trained him. I know how he thinks." Richards hesitated, unsure whether to follow orders or trust the man who had just turned their operation on its head. He wanted to argue, but something in Robert's eyes told him to step back. This wasn't a situation for bureaucracy. This was a crisis that only someone with Robert's experience could handle. Lieutenant Cruz, now fully understanding the gravity of the moment, spoke up. "He's right. You can't use traditional methods with Simon. You'll need Robert in there." Robert, without waiting for further debate, removed his communicator from his ear and began walking toward the building. The officers, still in disbelief, watched him with a mixture of awe and confusion. The elderly black man, who had been dismissed just hours earlier, was now the person who could end this crisis. He didn't move with the slow, tentative steps of someone in their twilight years. No. He moved with the quiet authority of someone who had been in command of countless high-stakes operations, someone who had seen it all and wasn't intimidated by the chaos. As he approached the building, the SWAT team, now on high alert, began to take up positions, their movements stiff and cautious. Carter, who had been leading the tactical operation, still looked like he couldn't quite believe what was happening. "He's committing suicide," Carter muttered under his breath, watching Robert walk towards the entrance. "No," Lieutenant Cruz countered, her voice filled with conviction. "He's doing something none of us could do. He's speaking the same language as the kidnapper." Inside the building, Robert's steps were steady, his heart calm as he ascended the stairs. He didn't duck or hide, he simply walked. It was almost as if he were going to check the mail. His composure was unnerving to the officers still behind the barricade, who exchanged nervous glances. They were all aware of the gravity of what was happening. At the 4th floor, Robert paused in front of apartment 402. He didn't hesitate, didn't falter. "Simon," he called out, his voice steady. "It's me, Wilson." From behind the door, a hoarse voice responded. "Commander? Is that really you in the flesh? Open the door. How do I know it's not a trap?" Robert smiled slightly, a small, knowing smile. "Eagle November 7th Alpha," he said, a code only Simon would recognize. There was a pause, then the sound of locks being undone. The door cracked open, revealing Simon Mercer, a man on the edge. His eyes were bloodshot, his face gaunt. The years had not been kind to him, and the weight of his past had driven him to the breaking point. The man who had once been Robert's best student was now a shadow of himself, broken, desperate. "Commander," Simon whispered, saluting instinctively, despite the madness around him. "They said you were dead." Robert's eyes softened for a moment. He had trained Simon to be better than this, to resist the demons inside, to stay focused, no matter what. But now, those demons had taken hold, and there was nothing left but the pain of abandonment and betrayal. "I was," Robert said quietly. "Almost." Simon stepped aside, allowing Robert to enter. Inside, the scene was as tense as it could get. 3 hostages sat bound on the floor, unharmed for now, but the threat of violence loomed over them like a dark cloud. Robert took in the scene in a single, experienced glance. The room was booby-trapped with explosives, 2 charges by the windows, 1 on the back door, and motion sensors at every entrance. "Why, Simon?" Robert asked, his voice gentle, though his eyes never wavered from the man he once knew. "Why did you do this?" Simon's face twisted with bitterness. "They abandoned us, Commander. After Beirut. They wiped our records, denied us treatment. I faked my death. But the voices, they won't stop." Robert nodded in understanding. He had seen it all too many times. Soldiers abandoned by the system they served, left to rot while the government moved on without them. The system had chewed them up and spit them out, and Simon had been one of the casualties. A man who had once been a hero was now a broken shell of himself. Outside, the SWAT team was still poised, ready to enter. But Robert wasn't done yet. "They're getting ready to storm the place," he said calmly. "Then we'll all die." Simon raised the detonator, his hands shaking. "If they try, I'll take this building down with me." Robert studied him for a moment. Then, his expression hardened, and he moved with sudden, deadly precision. In the blink of an eye, Simon's grip on the detonator was broken, and the device was in Robert's hands. It was over. But the SWAT team was still poised, preparing to break through. Then, Robert's voice rang out, cool and calm, over the radio. "Black Lamb. Abort immediately. Explosives." The entire team froze, as if time itself had stopped. No one moved, no one breathed. These weren't ordinary words. They were a code, Delta Protocol. Only the highest level of operations would ever use it. And now, Robert had just issued it. "Abort!" shouted one of the men, his voice full of panic and realization. "The code. It's Delta Protocol." The SWAT team hesitated, their conflicting orders tearing at them. And then, the door swung open, and Robert emerged, walking calmly through the chaos. Behind him, the hostages, disoriented but unharmed, followed in silence. Simon Mercer, handcuffed and head bowed, shuffled behind them. Captain Richards, who had once dismissed Robert, now stood in awe. Robert Wilson, the old man they had once ridiculed, had done what an entire team couldn't. And in that moment, every officer in that street learned the lesson Robert had been trying to teach them all along. Respect isn't given. It's earned. The night was still, the flashing lights of police cars casting long, fractured shadows across the street as Robert Wilson emerged from the building, leading the hostages behind him. The SWAT team, still frozen in place, stood in stunned silence. No one had moved in what felt like an eternity, and the realization of what had just transpired began to settle in. Robert was no longer the old man they had mocked. No longer the invisible man dismissed by younger officers who thought they knew better. He had stepped forward, not with arrogance or a desire for recognition, but because he knew what had to be done. He had saved the hostages. No one could deny that now. As medics tended to the shaken hostages, Robert handed Captain Richards the detonator and a small, worn notebook. The look of shock in Richards' eyes had been palpable when Robert had told him the full extent of the explosives, enough to obliterate half a block. Robert had known all along. He had been watching the signs, piecing together the story that no one else had cared to see. 3 weeks of planning, Robert had explained calmly. Enough explosives to take down a whole city block. He wasn't looking for money or a ransom. He needed help, not bullets. Captain Richards stared at Robert for a long moment, his expression slowly changing. Gone was the disdain, the skepticism, replaced by a humbling respect. "I owe you an apology," Richards said quietly, almost to himself, as he studied Robert's face. But Robert said nothing. He simply handed over the detonator. In the quiet that followed, something profound shifted between them, a mutual recognition of something far deeper than rank or authority. Robert didn't need anyone's apology. He had known all along that the only way to change things was through actions, not words. And now, the city would know exactly who he was. The media storm came soon after. Robert Wilson, the man they had all underestimated, was suddenly a hero. His story hit the front pages, the headlines shouting, "Forgotten Hero, Elderly Man Saves Hostages in High-Stakes Police Operation." The photos showed him, 72 years old, black and weathered, but standing tall in the face of adversity, receiving recognition that had long been denied to him. The video clips spread like wildfire on social media. People shared his story, his calm dignity in the face of disrespect, and the way he had been humiliated before everything changed. The phrase, "Hey, Grandpa," became a symbol, not of endearment, but of the systemic prejudice that had been at play. And it sparked a conversation. A conversation that needed to be had for far too long. But with the praise came the backlash. Lieutenant Carter, who had ridiculed Robert earlier, found himself facing an internal investigation. The department could no longer ignore the systemic abuse and discrimination that had colored his actions. Within days, Carter was demoted, sent to a small rural police station. His dreams of climbing the ranks evaporated in a single moment. As for Robert, his story continued to resonate. Lieutenant Cruz, who had been one of the few to listen and trust Robert, visited him frequently after the operation. She had seen something in him that no one else had. Respect. Real respect, not just for his military background, but for the way he had conducted himself in the most trying of situations. One day, sitting in Robert's modest apartment, Cruz finally asked him, "Why didn't you tell us about your background before?" Robert smiled softly, the kind of smile that spoke volumes. "You think anyone would believe it?" An old black man, saying he was a Special Forces commander. He paused, glancing around at his worn surroundings. "I've been invisible for too long, Lieutenant. I wasn't looking for any recognition." She absorbed the weight of his words, but there was more to it than that. She understood now. Respect wasn't something to be demanded. It was earned. Through actions. Through quiet dignity. Through a lifetime of service that no one knew about until it mattered. A few days later, the call came, a phone call that would change everything. "Mr. Wilson," the voice on the other end of the line said. "This is the National Security Director. We need to talk about your military record." Robert didn't need to hear more. He knew what was coming. The director explained that Simon Mercer wasn't the only one in need of help. Dozens of other veterans, just like him, had been abandoned after secret operations. their records erased, their medical needs ignored, their service forgotten. And now, with the public outcry after Robert's heroic act, the government had no choice but to address it. You trained these men, Mr. Wilson. You know them. We need your help to locate them, to bring them in, to save them from themselves, the director pleaded. Robert listened quietly, weighing the gravity of the situation. He had been discarded by the very system he had served, but now, when the spotlight was on him, they were asking for his help. For a moment, Robert considered the irony of it all, how the very people who had discarded him now needed him to save others. "I'll help," Robert finally said, his voice steady. "But I have one condition." There was a long pause. "A complete reintegration and treatment program for all abandoned operatives," he continued. "Official recognition. Retroactive medical benefits. It'll cost millions. But how many lives will it cost if you don't?" 3 months later, the Tempest program was officially inaugurated, a covert operation focused on locating and recovering the forgotten veterans of secret military missions. Robert Wilson was named the Director of Operations. It wasn't about the glory. It wasn't about the title. It was about making sure that the men who had fought for their country, who had been left behind, would finally receive the care and recognition they deserved. Simon Mercer was the first to enter the program, receiving the treatment he had long been denied. He had been lost, but Robert had never given up on him. Lieutenant Cruz, who had grown into a trusted ally, visited Robert regularly. She had become more than just a colleague. She had become a student, learning from the lessons Robert had imparted, lessons about humility, respect, and the importance of observation. A year later, Robert received an unexpected honor. During a ceremony at the police department, a training room was named in his honor, the Wilson Hall. It was dedicated to teaching future officers the art of observation and pattern recognition, skills that Robert had perfected over his lifetime. The new police chief stood before him at the ceremony, holding up a report. "Since the implementation of new protocols against bias," he began, "incidents of police violence have fallen by 40%. Complaints of discrimination have dropped by half. A single voice can change an entire system." Robert stood there, no fanfare, no speeches. He simply nodded. The quiet dignity he had shown that night had done more than any lecture or training manual could. His actions had spoken louder than anything. Later, as Robert conducted a class for new recruits, he noticed a familiar face in the back row. Lieutenant Carter, now without his insignia, now demoted, sitting humbly. He had requested a transfer to this training. "I thought maybe I needed to learn to observe better," Carter said quietly. Robert studied him for a long moment before finally responding. "Observation begins when you let go of your certainties," he said, a soft smile crossing his face. "Welcome." As Robert drove home that evening, he reflected on how a crisis could reveal someone's true character. Some people, like Carter, needed to fall before they could rise. Others, like Cruz, just needed a quiet example to follow. On the wall of his apartment, a new photo stood out among the old ones. Robert Wilson receiving a civilian Medal of Honor alongside 3 hostages who would never know how close they had come to dying. Their lives had been saved, not by guns or bombs, but by the quiet, unyielding dignity of one man who refused to be ignored. In the end, Robert Wilson's greatest victory was not in the medal, nor the belated recognition. It was in the 5 words that had paralyzed an elite team and in the legacy he left behind: "Respect is not a rank." His quiet dignity spoke louder than any siren, proving that wisdom gained over a lifetime is more powerful than any weapon. And true respect is earned, not demanded.